morning and welcome to Relentless Rock Ministries. We're going to start a series this morning on the inner self. We'll be talking about that throughout the year. Now, today's message is entitled, or is actually titled, Filled with His Own Ways. As we start this sermon, let's look at Proverbs chapter 14, verse 14. The backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways, but a good man will be satisfied from above. You know, there is nowhere so evident than in the life of Lot that we see this. Lot is one of the saddest characters in the Bible, and his life screams a warning to us. Don't end up with your own ways. Let's begin looking at the steps of his backsliding. First of all, Lot made a wrong choice. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 13, verse 11. Then Lot chose for himself the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Lot's character is revealed by his choices. He took the very best share of the land, even though it meant living near Sodom, a city known for its sin. He was greedy, wanting the best for himself without even considering his uncle Abram's needs or what was fair. The choice here is really a small thing. It was just one in a series of choices in Lot's life. Secondly, it was a wrong move. Let's continue with verse 12. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot in the land of the plains of the cities, and pitched as far as Sodom. Good pasture and available water seemed like a wise choice to Lot at the time. But he failed to recognize that wicked Sodom could provide temptation strong enough to destroy his family. It was not a huge move. They lived in the area anyway. It was more of a change in direction. In your personal life, have you chosen to live or work in Sodom? Even though you may be strong enough to resist the temptations yourself, others in your family may not. And while God commands us to reach people in the Sodom where we live, we must be careful not to become the very people we're trying to reach. The third point I'd like to make is that this was a wrong location. And if we look at Genesis chapter 14, verse 12, we see the following. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Lot's greedy desire for the best of everything led him into sinful surroundings. His burning desire for possessions and success cost him his freedom and enjoyment, and as a captive he faced torture, slavery, or death. It was a small, another step, but the move put him right in the heart of where he had been leaning toward all along, and in much of the same way, we can be enticed into doing things or going places we shouldn't. The prosperity that we long for is captivating, but it can both entice us and enslave us if our motives are not in line with God's desires. The fourth point I'd like to make is that it brought forth wrong associations. And if we look at Genesis chapter 19, starting with the first verse, we see the following. Now, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. The gateway of the city was the meeting place for city officials and other men to discuss current events and transact business. It was a place of authority and status where a person could be seen and heard. Evidently, Lot held an important position in the government or associated at minimum with those who did, because the angels found him at the city gate. Lot's status in Sodom was one reason he was so reluctant to leave. He had actually become a part of what he was moving toward. The worst part of it was that he knew it was wrong all of the time. And if we look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, we see the following that Peter wrote. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked for that righteous man dwelling among them. Tormented his righteous soul for day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. What we see in Lot are the 5 signs of backsliding. First of all, we see his turning away from godly influences. Lot turned away from godly Abraham. And today, like Lot, many of us turn from such influence as the Word, prayer, the church, and Christian friends and family. The second point is Lot started living on the edge of the world. He got so dangerously close to habits and the culture of Sodom without first getting into it at first. Today, many of us want to be as close as possible to the edge without falling off or into the abyss of sin. Third, Lot adopted the ways of the world. There was a measure of this in his encounter with the 2 angels. He tended to become like those with whom he associated. Fourth, Lot placed personal gain above God. His temptation was not even that intense. He simply chose gain. Today, we sometimes are sorely tempted in the choice between godliness and gain. And finally, Lot elevated the unsaved and the unspiritual. He lived among the ungodly. He allowed their influence to shape his life. And as a result of his backsliding, Lot suffered immense sorrow. First of all, he lost his testimony, which we see demonstrated by the lack of respect that is shown to him by the men of Sodom. And we look at that very closely at Genesis chapter 19, verse 5. It really bears this out. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally." Secondly, Lot lost his senses. And if we look further in chapter 19 and go and drop down to verse 8, we see the following. "See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring you them, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men. Since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof." Now, how could any father give his daughter to be ravished by a mob of perverts just to protect 2 strangers? There are no mitigating factors. And although it was the custom of the day to protect guests at any cost, this terrible suggestion reveals how deeply absorbed sin had become into Lot's life. He had become so hardened to the evil acts in an evil city, he had a giant callous. And whatever Lot's motives were, we have an illustration of Sodom's terrible wickedness, a wickedness that is so great that God had to destroy the entire city. Third point I'd like to make, Lot lost his influence. And if we look further down in verse 14, we see, "So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, 'Get up and get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city.' But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking." What we see here is that Lot's sons-in-laws would not listen to him, and as a result, he actually lost his family. Lot had lived so long and so contently among ungodly people that he was no longer a believable witness for God. He had allowed his influence to shape him rather than shaping his environment. Lot is now compromised to the point that he was almost useless to God. And when he finally makes a stand, no one listens. To make a difference, we must first decide to be different in our faith and in our conduct. Fourth, Lot lost his possessions. Lot left town with the clothing on his back. And the irony here is that it was his desire for gain that led him astray in the first place. And the fifth point I want to make is that Lot lost his wife. She was not really with him, and it appears that her turning to the city was more than mere curiosity. And if we look at verse 26, we see this. "But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt." What we see here is that clinging to the past, she was unwilling to turn completely away. So I ask you this question. Are you looking back longingly at sin while you're trying to move forward with God? You're not going to make progress as long with God as long as you are holding on to pieces of your old life. Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. No one person can serve two masters. Lot lost his spiritual sensitivity as well. And if we look at verses 18 through 20, we see Lot stating, Then Lot to them said, Please, no, my lords, indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now that this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one, and my soul shall live? Lot stands and argues with the Lord. However, he eventually has to abandon what he argued with the Lord about in the first place. And finally, Lot lost his own virtue and that of his daughters. And when we look at Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 through 38, which I'm not going to read, we notice that he ends up in drunken incest, and we don't ever hear of him again. Lot likely died a broken man. And in this pitiful sequence to the story of the destruction of Sodom, we see two women compelled to preserve their family line. They were driven not by lust, but by desperation. They feared that they would never marry. And Lot's tendency to compromise and refusal reached its peak. He should have found the right partners for his daughters long before this. Lot's family wasn't far away, Abraham's family wasn't far away. And that's the true irony of this. Now, the two daughters stooped to incest, showing their acceptance of the morals of Sodom. We are most likely to sin when we are desperate for what we feel we must have. However, there is a solution to Lot's backsliding. And if we look at 19 verse 16, we see the following. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of the two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. Lot hesitated, so the angels grasped his hand and rushed him to safety. Lot did not want to abandon the wealth, position, and comfort he enjoyed in Sodom. And you know, it is easy for us to criticize Lot for being hypnotized by Sodom when the choice seems so clear to us. To be wiser than Lot, we must see our hesitation to obey stems from false attractions that are going on in our current culture today. Notice how God showed mercy to Lot due to the result of the intercession of Abraham. Lot himself could lay claim to nothing. What a sad way to live and end a life. Lot's own life cries out to all of us to turn back from where we are on the road. Fortunately, a righteous man can often affect others for good. James 5:16 tells us that the prayers of a righteous person are powerful. All believers should follow Abraham's example and pray for others to be saved. Amen and amen. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this sermon, and we would look forward to seeing you again next week when I present the second in this series. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord's countenance shine upon you and give you grace. Amen and amen.